To close us out, we have three incredible panelists. Our first is Barry Eidlin. Barry Eidlin is an associate professor of sociology at McGill University. He is a comparative historical sociologist interested in the study of class, politics, social movements, and social change. He is the author of Labor and the Class Idea in the United States and Canada. Prior to embarking on his academic career, he spent several years as a union organizer, mainly with Teamsters for a Democratic Union. Welcome, Barry.
Whoa, oh, okay. I'll just keep that there. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much, Sarah. You've just done such a phenomenal job organizing this. I just can't stress that enough. And to Steve for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be in this room, and the discussions have been just really thought-provoking. I really appreciate it. So we're talking here about what's at stake. At one level, the answer is simple, right? The answer is that what's at stake is the future of the university. If we're feeling a bit ambitious, we could add to that the possibility of a better world. But identifying what's at stake is just the starting point for a deeper discussion that I think raises far more questions than it answers. So I'll do my best to identify what I see as those key questions that are at the core of thinking about the future of the university and our role in shaping it. So if we identify the future of the university as the core of what's at stake, the first thing we need to ask is, what are we fighting for? What kind of university do we want? And here, all those slogans come to mind, right? Whose university, our university, universities for the public good, so on and so forth. At their core, these are demands to decommodify higher education and to reclaim it as a public good. And that's, at a general level, the basic thing that a welfare state does: remove goods and services deemed necessary for human well-being from market pressures and allocate them according to need or make them universally available to all. Now, there was considerable progress made in this direction in the post-war decades, as many of us know. Universities shifted from being these fairly esoteric training grounds for the elite to mass institutions of higher learning and advanced research open to a much broader swath of the population. This was due not only to massive public investment in higher education and research, but also policies like free or low-cost tuition, more relaxed admissions policies, even open admissions at Carolina's institution of CUNY in the 1970s. There's also things like a lot of multifamily housing being built in the 1960s and 70s, which created a stock of affordable housing for students. So debt burden, rent burden, these concepts were just not much of a thing for undergrads and grad students in this time period. And meanwhile, in a broader context of post-war economic growth and university expansion, the labor market was a lot tighter, so undergraduate and graduate students had a lot more options for after they graduated. For undergraduates, that was less worrying about career choices and thinking about the return on investment for their major. For graduates, it meant that you could enter a PhD program with a fairly good chance of ending up with a tenure-track faculty position. And that fundamentally shaped expectations differently within the world of higher education. Now, of course, as many of us know, this expansion came with many caveats. Most notably, there are the people who were left out, or at least didn't benefit as much, namely women and people of color. There was still a lot of old boys clubs at work, and as for research, there was certainly a lot more generous public funding that we see today, but also much more circumscribed notions of what constituted so-called appropriate areas of research. It took the social movements of the 60s to create a lot of the space for research that could be relevant to more broader communities. And as for the STEM fields, there was certainly a lot of basic and applied research that made real material advances for social progress. There was plenty of funding for military and corporate research. The anti-Vietnam War movement exposed a lot of that. So the post-war university was deeply integrated into a post-war military-industrial complex. So just as we acknowledge that the post-war expansion of higher education was the most dramatic democratization and decommodification of the university that we've ever seen, it's also not the future we're fighting for. This is not our university, because it still left out so many of the people who make up us. So we cannot view our project, however we define it, as simply trying to return to some fictional golden age of the university. There are certainly parts of that worth recapturing, like massive public investment in higher education and basic research funded by taxing the rich. That's not a bad start, but we can't stop there. So where do we go? And that's not a question I can answer myself, but it's a question that must be at the heart of our movement's debates and discussions. Certainly setting decommodification of higher ed as the strategic goal is a start, but that leaves a lot of key questions open, and these answers will have to come out of the movements we build for the future of higher education. And I think that we've already seen some of this work in the discussions we've had today and the movements that have raised demands for canceling student debt, ending rent burden, for example. The next question then is, how do we get there? And here I think is where things get exciting, because a lot of the answers have to do with the very things we've been talking about all day today and which brought us here to Santa Cruz in the first place. So given the transformations in higher education, the rise of the corporate university, clearly labor unions have a critical role to play in the fight for the future of the university. I would say that the transformation of the fight for higher ed from a student struggle to a labor struggle is one of the more promising developments that I've seen. As many of you here have shown or are showing, combining public protest with the withholding of our labor creates leverage with university administrators and political figures that the moral suasion of student politics simply cannot match. It forces them to the bargaining table and structurally shifts the balance of power in a way that you can't get from simply mass protests and building occupations. So the fact that we're seeing a wave of new organizing and striking on campuses across the country starts to shift the discussion of what's possible for the future of the university. And I'd like to pause here to think about what's driving this wave, and the first thing I want to emphasize is that what we're seeing is something new and unprecedented. It is easy to forget in the current climate, but it is not normal for workers to win union representation elections repeatedly by 90 to 95% margins. It's not normal for there to be 15 strikes involving tens of thousands of academic workers in a single year, and that's just 2022. That's not counting the strikes we've seen this year at Temple, at Rutgers, Michigan, UIC, elsewhere. It's not normal for unions to win 20 to 80% wage increases in a 2-year contract, as UC workers did this last year. Obviously it's great, but it's not normal. For some historical perspective, academic worker organizing came out of the student movements of the 60s. There's some small beachheads at Wisconsin, at Michigan, picked up in the 90s, picked up a couple more publics, UMass, University of California. Private universities were largely excluded by the National Labor Relations Act. They were deemed to be student apprentices, not workers. It's changed in the 2000s. The NLRB went back and forth on the question, and then the Columbia decision in 2016 sort of legalized private university organizing. But even in those periods where it was legal, where there was access to collective bargaining rights, it was tough. There weren't that many organizing campaigns. Those that made it to an election lost often, and those that won were close. And there certainly was no wave effect after those wins. There weren't that many strikes. Of course, it's important to recognize that the ground was shifting in this time period, and all those struggles in their own way laid the groundwork for the movement that we're witnessing today. So what's changed now? It's not like neoliberalism and the corporate university have just appeared in the past couple of years. It's not like overwork, harassment, low pay, exploitative working conditions are something new in higher education. It's not like the academic job market hasn't been bleak for most of us for a decade or more, removing its ability to serve as future incentive to justify our current exploitation. these are the issues that drive academic workers to organize and to go on strike today. But they're not new issues. So why are academic workers now more willing to take action to address these issues as workers? At a basic level, I would say that academic workers figured out the answer to another big question, which is, who are we? And the answer to that, of course, is that we are workers. And this was always the question at the heart of the legal disputes about organizing academic workers at private universities. And of course, the idea that academic workers are workers has been the core idea that has driven academic worker organizing for decades. But it has often been a tough sell amongst academic workers ourselves. Before we could get to discussions of why a union makes sense, why you sign a card, contract negotiations, striking, enforcement, all those other challenges of forming and becoming a union, we had to have these more basic conversations about who we are and convince our coworkers that we were in fact workers. And that involved having to confront and undo a lot of the received wisdom about what the university is, what being a grad student is supposed to be like. And frankly, a lot of time that just didn't work. And that was especially for much of this time period in the lab-based disciplines. Now, the question of whether or not we are workers, I think, now is largely resolved, although doubts do remain. Most academic workers now get that they are workers, that unionizing makes sense, and this has largely rendered the legal dispute moot, although it does appear that some universities seem intent on revisiting the question. I'm looking at you, Duke. Now, why did the question get resolved now? And here I can offer conjectures. I'm a sociologist, I don't have any hard empirical evidence about this, but I've been thinking about it. I've got a few ideas. Obviously, one is the pandemic. I don't really need to rehash that one. I think another one, I would argue, is the exhaustion of the student movement option. There have been protests about the corporate university for decades that really haven't done a whole lot at sort of stanching the bleeding, and austerity has proceeded apace. And then a third would have to be the demonstration effect of other organizing and strikes we're seeing. If you look at the organizing at Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, REI, these are groups of workers who demographically look a lot like academic workers. So there's a bit of a sense of, if they can do it, why can't we? And now that the who are we question has been resolved, at least to some extent, it opens up new avenues for fighting for the future of the university. By organizing as workers into unions, academic workers have found a more effective tool for responding to the challenges of the corporate university. So first, the collective bargaining relationship creates a structural condition where administrators have to negotiate with us. They don't have to come to agreement, they draw things out forever, but that's a fundamentally different relationship than the ad hoc situation you have with traditional student protest or the sort of unenforceable consultative situation you face with traditional university governance. It creates opportunities for advancing demands and placing costs on university administrations that wouldn't exist otherwise. Number two, organizing into unions creates different opportunities for solidarity and coalition building. So instead of being limited to on-campus or cross-campus coordination, unionization puts academic workers into structural relationships with other unions and workers beyond the campus. And this is important on at least two levels. Number one, on campus, I'd say that redefining academic conflicts as labor conflicts makes them subject to the basic rules of labor solidarity. So unlike student protest that gets dismissed as some loudmouth extremists and can seem foreign or even threatening to some workers coming from off campus, labor protest makes sense to other union workers. And we heard about that earlier today. They understand contract disputes, they understand you don't cross picket lines. So that can make on-campus protest a lot more effective. Number two, organizing as workers within unions creates organic connections between campus workers and unions and workers off campus. And this is vital because many of the problems of the corporate university cannot be resolved on campus. Thanks. To take an obvious example, the problem of rent burden cannot be resolved solely through campus workers engaging in militant action and tough collective bargaining on campus, even if we do manage to win a COLA. Reshaping housing markets requires political leverage, broader community alliances that are much easier to create when you're plugged into a broader labor movement. Another example would be the angst that our students feel about job prospects, which pressures them to pursue more degrees and take on more debt. But of course, a key force driving that is that there are huge earnings gap between those with college degrees and those without. But unions have and can play a role in creating more decent, livable jobs for all, regardless of education. These are not panaceas, but of course it creates a different and better set of opportunities for confronting the corporate universities. So in sum, if we're thinking about what's at stake in the current moment in terms of fighting for the future of the university, the current upsurge creates promising new conditions that could shift the balance of power on campus. We've only seen the glimmers of the beginnings of what this could be, but it's far more than what we've seen in recent decades. That being said, it's important to keep the current upsurge in perspective. At a basic level, we don't know how it's going to turn out. We're up against some very powerful forces that are very good at adapting to challenges to their power. But even if the upsurge in higher ed is successful, we also have to recognize that as important as it would be, it needs to be tied to a broader labor and working class upsurge that frankly isn't there quite yet. People can debate this in the Q&A, but I would argue that notwithstanding the increased capital flows into and corporate influence over higher ed, it is not the sector that can lead a broader labor upsurge. We still need to rebuild labor's power in more traditional sectors, particularly manufacturing and logistics, I would argue. Just 2 more sentences. If we want to expand that fight for the future of the university into a fight for a better world. Still, I would argue that the organizing terrain we're navigating today, both in higher education and beyond, is far more favorable than anything certainly I could have imagined even just a few years ago. The key is figuring out how to take advantage of that, and I would say that events like the one we're here at today are just what is needed to do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Ellen David Friedman. Ellen has been a labor organizer for nearly 50 years, working on the rank and file pole of the labor movement, primarily in the teacher sector. She is chair of the Labor Notes Board and a facilitator of UCOR, the United Caucuses of Rank and File Educators. Welcome, Ellen.
Hello, comrades. I have to start by saying that anything that I offer here that reflects any consolidated wisdom from this period of strikes is owing to people in this room, like Sarah, like our comrades at Temple, at the University of Michigan, Jack, Stefan, the people from whom I have learned because you have shown me the trust to allow me in the door. Oh dear, am I going to get teary? I am at critical moments when the fear of the audacity of what you had brought yourself to exploded in your midst. And you said, are we actually taking on this power struggle? And somehow I would get called to try and calm you down. And and I'd say, do the only thing that you know you need to do, just talk to each other. Just talk to each other. And you did it every time. You were willing every time. So what's at stake here? I'm not going to talk about the future of the university. I could talk about the future of society and whether we are headed for socialism or barbarism. I'm not optimistic on that at this moment. But here's what I want to talk about, and I want to speak as an organizer, not as an academic, which is easy to do because I'm not. Here is what I have learned from my 50 years in the labor movement that I am infinitely grateful to have lived and remained active to this moment, to see what is coalescing here. What is essentially unifying, empowering, and in the end will be unassailable about the movement that is starting now in the higher ed upsurge are two things that have not been present in my 50 years in the labor movement. One of those is the willingness to be vulnerable to fully participatory democratic practice and the belief that workers can govern themselves, that we can govern ourselves. That has not ever been an element in the bureaucratic, legally regulated, utterly collusive version of trade unionism we have had in this country in my entire life. Here's why. In the post-war accord, the golden period after World War II, when industrial labor relations became synonymous with labor capital or labor management framework, it was a legal relationship, the presumption was all we're going to get to do is engage in labor management consultation to see how much we can claw back from the boss of their profits. That's what it was. And our industrial labor relations system is that. The state will recognize your right to engage in discussions with the employer about how much of the surplus labor they have stolen from you and turned into capital and turned into political power, how much of that you might be able to bargain back. The presumption, as we all know, I'm pretty sure in this room we all know and understand, the presumption is that you are not going to challenge the existence of labor capital antagonism. You are going to abide with it. You are going to accommodate yourself to it. And so we did. Well, I got pretty depressed about this in the late 1990s because I've been a Marxist since about 1968. And I got a little worried that there wasn't really a future here. And as some people here in the room or friends of mine know, I got so concerned and not seeing a real future for our labor movement. My husband and I followed our son, who is a China labor scholar, to China, and I spent 10 years there working in the labor movement, or whatever you would call it, in China. And I think I needed to do it to kind of get my head clear. Well, it was very effective for that. And it showed me our future. It showed me our future, which is a little frightening. And the future that it showed me is the reality of what happens when institutions of democratic participation do not challenge capitalism itself. Then they are only there to manage us. That's what they're there for. They are there to manage us. They are there to lower our expectations, to bring our expectations into some realistic guidance that is provided for us by things like comparables. How many of you here have ever been at a bargaining table and had, either your union tell you, well, you have to compare, the way in which we're going to bargain is you're going to find out what are the comparables to the next nearestly situated workers who are like you. And many, many other things. These are all market-based logics. So when I came back from China about 2015, and I said, all right, I am done with that system. I don't have a boss. I've been retired now for 15 years or more. And I just decided I was going to look to where in our labor movement there was the possibility of an embedding of enough of a radical impulse, enough of a radical beating heart for the issue of democracy, that it was going to be possible to leverage that into a struggle for power, which by necessity meant, first of all, you got to tell your union bosses to go to hell. You just have to. Labor Notes has occupied this pole of the labor movement since the 1970s. The absolute dead certainty that workers need unions, that we have to build unions, that we have to populate unions, that every worker should have a union, but that almost all of our unions fail to be the unions we need. And so our struggle first, last, and always seems to be make those unions be the unions they need to be so you can fight the boss. And when I got a random call from Sarah in 2019, because I knew her younger sister, and she said, I wonder, would you be willing to talk to us? Because, I don't know, it looks like we might be about to go out on a completely illegal wildcat strike here in Santa Cruz. And I don't know, like we're mid-contract and the 2865 leadership is completely opposed to us. They're going to sanction us. We don't know. And we're being threatened. And should the entire executive board, the officers resign because otherwise we're going to be thrown in jail or something like that? So anyway, from that moment till now, I have had the incredible good fortune of being a tag-along to this higher ed labor upsurge. And to Sarah and the other comrades here, I'm so grateful for that. Because the two things that I think are at stake, as I said, is one is the willingness to try and seize democratic participation as a tool to build power, to change our unions. People in this room have changed the balance of power with 2865. It's not over yet, man, but you have gone so damn far. You have gone so far. And UAWD, for those of you who know, a caucus that is barely, like it's still really wet behind the ears, right? It's a very young caucus. They're just finding their way. But they did manage to get most of UAW's national leadership put in jail where they belong, right? And they did get to win the confidence of UAW members, both higher education and manufacturing, to say, oh, I guess we don't need crooks running our union anymore. We might actually need people who want to fight for the workers. And I think I would say 2865 votes put Sean Fain over the top, just saying. Anyway, so you are part of a pro-democracy trend in the labor movement, which I can tell you with great authority, because I have been yearning for this for most of the last 50 years. A comrade here, Joel Jordan, he and I are from the founding generation of Labor Notes. We've been watching this closely. I think Joel would agree with me. We are not imagining this. This is a historical development. It is underway. You are part of it. You can put your trust in it, and it's about democracy. But I'm going to finish with one last thought. I don't even know what my time is, but I'm going to finish now. It is not just about democracy, because, you know, there's a lot of talk about rank and file unionism and democratic rank and file unionism. These are easy pieces of rhetoric to throw around. They don't mean very much. Here's what means much, and here's why I think this higher ed labor upsurge is a vanguard moment. And, okay, it doesn't matter what you do in the labor movement. It doesn't matter what you are building, how much power you build, or what you win in the contract, if you have not advanced the purpose of critical thinking among your coworkers. It doesn't matter. Unless individuals, and then collectively, as individual workers and collectively as workers, we can come to understand ourselves as subjects of capitalism at a certain stage, at a certain point in its life cycle, with certain material realities that imposes on us. If we cannot grasp that with the full powers of our critical collective thinking, then we will be vanquished. Democratic forms don't do it. He said we're going to have consensus decision-making, we're going to have general membership meetings with 1,000 people. That's fantastic, but if 1,000 people come into it with a culture of hierarchy in their brains, it'll fracture, it'll fall apart. You'll have factions. You'll have people grandstanding. You'll have opportunists come into your movement to try. Well, I know, I'm looking at those knowing smiles out there. I know this stuff. You cannot protect yourself just with democratic form. You must protect yourselves and what we are fighting for with the irreplaceable gift of critical thinking. So part of why I have so much faith and confidence and love for this movement that you all are building is because you work with the life of the mind. But everyone in this room, everyone who has spoken, everybody you're connected to, you are not only living in the life of the mind. You understand that the principle of theory and practice is very real. It's very real. Bring people into collective struggle. Help people learn how to fight. Fight alongside them with the highest degree of respect, of comradeship, of love, unconditional love for one another, but mostly for the sharpening of your values, the sharpening of your understanding of the world that you can only get if you trust one another to think through and make the decisions you need to make. Anything that is imposed on you from above as someone's plan for you, subject that to critical thinking. Anything that is ungrounded in an analysis of the current conditions, subject that to critical thinking. I'll finish now. I'll give my 2 minutes. I cede my 2 minutes to Jamie Woodcock. Again, I am so grateful and so honored. Actually, the last thing I'll say is this, which I always tell people when I'm in calls with you, is because I get to work off the platform of Labor Notes and through lots of different networks, every time I have a conversation with any of you, which is filled with brilliant insight, which is pretty much every day, it gets out, it gets telegraphed out. The conversations I had with my comrades from Dartmouth, got immediately transferred to the undergraduate student workers in Kenyon, who have not been recognized for 2 years, right? They've had 5 strikes as an unrecognized union over the last 2 years. Janina, who I've had the opportunity to meet and work with a little bit over the last few years, her brilliance will show up in my next conversations with workers. Please keep going, write about what you do, come to Labor Notes conferences, tell your stories, keep going, you can save us all.
Thank you, Ellen. Our next and final speaker is Jamie Woodcock. Jamie is a senior lecturer at the University of Essex and a researcher based in London. He is an editor of Notes from Below and helps to publish the University Worker Bulletin. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, Sarah, and to everybody else for organising today. Sorry, yes, I'm a little bit taller. Is that better? So I want to say 3 things today. I want to talk about the crisis of higher education, and I hope that there are some similarities between our experience in Britain and what's happening in the US. I want to talk a bit about class composition, and I want to talk about a rank and file strategy in HE. And I also want to start with a brief biographical note, which is that I've worked in higher education for 10 years. And over those 10 years, and maybe James or Roberto can correct me on the details, I think we've been on strike every year except one. And this has been through a range of different strikes. One year we had lunchtime strikes, which I hope all of you take every day. Sometimes we've had a few days here or there. Sometimes we've had weeks. This year we've had 18 days, and we're now moving into a marking boycott, the first time since 2006. And it's been an interesting moment for me going through this current dispute, because it's the first time I've ever felt scared about taking industrial action. Our union is very used to taking regular industrial action. To having 2 days here or there. Whereas now, I will find out on Friday whether I'm losing 80% of my pay for the next 3 months for taking part in the marking boycott. So it feels like a step up in the kind of industrial action that we're taking. But it's also been incredibly exciting to hear about what's been happening in the US, because the last time I heard about academic unions in the US was maybe 5 or 6 years ago at Labour Notes. We had a flash occupation of our union's headquarters. We defeated a deal that the union tried to push on us. We'd been on strike. We came to Labour Notes to talk about some of the struggles we've been involved in. And we had this great workshop with academic workers. And then we realized nobody else had ever been on strike in higher education. And we had this kind of weird moment of thinking, I'm not quite sure what to advise you on. And then coming here this time to the US and hearing about all the things that have happened since, incredibly inspiring struggles. And what I've really appreciated is the kind of gritty detail of some of the things people are going through, because I think these are the things we need to share and talk about. But I did promise I was going to talk about some other things. So the first about the crisis of HE, I think we've heard a bit about the history of universities and how they have changed, from the post-war period to now. And really the only point I want to make about the history of higher education is that today a lot of people look back nostalgically about how HE was in the past. And I think if we actually look at the history of higher education, that rose-tinted vision of HE is either not true or was only true for a very small number of people. And I want to give an example about this from Britain. We have a very old higher education institution. Some of the universities go back 1,000 years or so. It's a very long history of higher education. The vast majority of it was just for elite education. It's gone through a number of crises of being opened up to more and more people. And the most recent of these is about the massification of higher education and the introduction of tuition fees from the 1990s. But this idea that the university is a place where you can go for the pursuit of knowledge, that there's academic freedom, this is not an experience that many people have in teaching in higher education today. To give you an example of this, I'm a Marxist who works in a business school. Hopefully this makes sense to all of you. I teach 400 students in a lecture who at one stage were paying more than my annual salary to come and get a master's degree in business from a young Marxist who knows nothing about business, and then spend my time writing about Marx. The university doesn't value the research, but what the university is valuing is a number of shifts that have happened in British higher education. The first is about financialization of the university system. So a huge growth of many of these institutions, and particularly a competition around international students. So huge numbers of international students come to the UK to study, to pay triple home fees, to pay very large amounts of money, to get a British university degree, which then they imagine will help them with their career in another country. And so the university system as it stands in Britain is funded both on funding from external international students who probably haven't made that money from not exploiting people in other countries, to the debt of British students are having to get into in order to study. And one of the important differences, I think, with Britain to the US is there's been a change in the composition of teaching in higher education. One part about this, and Roberto and I were trying to think of some of the differences here, is in Britain, you're now expected to finish a PhD in 3 years. You might teach for one of those years, maybe 2. And there's been a huge growth. We don't have tenure in Britain. It's worth saying as a start. We have permanent contracts of which you can be fired from. So it's permanent, but it's not actually permanent. And what we've had is a huge growth of the layer in between PhD students and what you would consider tenured faculty. So people who are essentially trying to get permanency and are working 1, 2, 3 academic jobs at the same time, they're no longer graduate students. And they're increasingly doing the bulk of teaching in higher education. And I think one of the shifts around the composition of universities has been a shift in who is doing the work inside universities around teaching. And I think, Roberto, I think it was you that mentioned it in your talk, is it's no longer a kind of apprenticeship model where if you do a PhD, there's an expectation you'll move on to permanency. In my PhD cohort, there were 12 students. I think only 2 now work in a university. The majority have moved on to other forms of work. So there is a kind of crisis in how teaching is being delivered, which is shaping people's experience of working in higher education. But the other thing that I think is important to note about the composition of universities is that ultimately my job, as well as many of my colleagues, is about preparing the next generation of workers and changing class composition of the experience of people who go through higher education. When I was a student, which was a while ago, but not that long ago, most people didn't work while they were studying. I received a government grant to go to university. Rent was more affordable than it is now. Whereas now the majority of my students work. They have much less time on campuses. They have a very different experience of higher education. And so part of this has meant that in the intervening 10 years or so, student movements have disappeared from British university campuses. There isn't that same experience of politicized student unions, of debates around politics, both around trade unionism and more widely among students. And I think one of the ways we can think about the future of higher education is by focusing on the present of higher education now. And I think talking about class composition, by which I mean the technical composition of our work, so how we organized in the university by capital or by our managers or whoever is directing us. How is our work changing? How are the conditions of our work changing? How do we relate to other workers in the university setting? And thinking about how that affects the forms of struggle that we take, whether we go on strike, whether we have unions, or otherwise. And I think in Britain we see 2 things that are shaping the jump from that changing technical composition of our work to the forms of struggle that we're taking. And the first is related a little bit to the question I asked in the previous session about wall-to-wall organising. Is we've had a long history in Britain, the last decade or so, of outsourced workers' struggles in London. So cleaners, security guards, catering, mainly who work not directly for the university, but through a patchwork of outsourcing companies, who've regularly been on strike, have had protests on campuses, and have really been a model to earlier career academics like myself about what struggle looks like in a university. Disruptive struggle that, I'd love to think the university comes grinding to a halt when I don't teach my business lecture. I'm sure some parts of it do. But people who, if they don't come to work, the buildings aren't opened, the buildings aren't clean, there's no food on campus. And this has been quite a powerful example of what taking action can look like in the university, as well as a much wider strike wave that's happening in Britain today. We've had a day of 1 million workers on strike in Britain, across the public sector, transport. And so strikes are something that are being talked about quite regularly in Britain. But this doesn't come without challenges. The current wave of struggles that are happening in Britain are focused very narrowly around cost of living demands, around trying to get wage increases above inflation. And what's been interesting about the current wave of struggles is they've been called from above by union leaderships. In the postal service, in nursing, in transportation, in higher education. I'd love to tell you that Roberto, James and I have pushed our union leadership into calling national strikes on our own. But in part, these struggles have come about through a fear of union leaderships losing the favor of members, that if they can't fight now, what's the point of remaining in a union? And so we have this interesting moment of a very large level of struggle with quite low levels of rank and file organizing. What's important about it is it opens up the possibility for us to do more at a rank and file level. If you go to any picket line in a British university over the last 10 years, people will say to you, I'm on strike for a pay rise or around the pension scheme. It's been a big part of our struggles. What people will also say is, but I'm not on strike just for that. I'm on strike because I want, my students to have better funding. I want the university to work in a different way. I want it to be more inclusive, but have struggled to find ways to express that to the current union form that we have. And I think there are two solutions to this current moment of thinking about an alternative way that we can fight for higher education. And I think the first is about thinking through the forms in which we engage in these struggles in university. Now, one of the problems with talking about industrial unionism or wall-to-wall organizing is we inherit the forms of organizing that we have in our workplaces already. So one of the things that we've argued about in Notes from Below through looking at education struggles is what would really fit in higher education, as well as pre-18 education, so schools and colleges, is industrial unionism. Organizing people regardless of their job type, whether they clean the university, whether they teach, whether they provide administrative support, whatever they do. But we can't just have an ideal form and kind of step back from it and say, well, we're just going to leave our unions and build something else. And so instead, we've taken this model of organizing in some universities of trying to act as if we are industrial unions. And I was really inspired to hear about the garbage, I hope I'm using the correct American term there, garbage refuse workers of going and talking to people on the campus and trying to organize with them. It doesn't matter if we're in the same union as people or not. We can talk to them, we can try and organize them, we can try and coordinate. And so one of the most exciting moments of the past couple of years has been a strike on UCL, University College London campus, where the UCU union was on strike, as well as an independent union that organized cleaners and security guards, coordinated to have that strike on the same day, regardless of the differences between the two unions. The second part is to think about what organizing rank and file power in our unions looks like. And I think here I want to make an argument that might at first not sound like the right way around to think about it. But if we want to fight for an alternative kind of higher education, we need to take seriously the small issues in our workplace. As I said, I've been on strike 9 years out of 10 for issues around pay, issues around pensions. But so little in the UK, what happens is we don't talk about the small problems that are happening in our universities. I was talking in the break about the expectations for us to rank our colleagues in terms of their academic performance. This is a big metric thing that we have to do in British universities. And if we talk to each other about this and about the effect it has on the university, we are participating in the changes that we don't want to see happening in the university, and seeing our struggles as being part of these big national campaigns that we take part in. Is instead what we need to think about is how are we as rank and file members taking action around changes to higher education, both around the wage struggle, but also thinking about what bits of the university we participate in and what bits we don't. And one of the lessons we've learned from the past 10 years is our union only ever grows when we take action together. That action builds organization. The second point is that we have to organize democratically. And I don't mean this in an ideal, kind of idealistic sense that it's important to be democratic and we should take this as an abstract principle. But that if we want to win in our universities, we have to take seriously the different perspectives, the different types of jobs that are taking place in the university, and build collectively across those roles to fight for another kind of vision of higher education. And then finally, we have to take seriously what it means to do rank and file organizing. And I think here, we're not talking about trying to take over our union in Britain. We've had a recent experience of that didn't work so well. But instead to think about what actions can we take that build our confidence at the rank and file level, that build our combativity, how we fight, and also build our consciousness around the issues that are happening. And one very small example, and I promise I'll finish on this, is a rank and file bulletin that we've run for many years in higher education. And in part, this is to have an independent way of talking about the struggles that we're involved in, but also to say that normal rank and file members of the union have something to say and should share those ideas and test them out in practice, because ultimately that's the only way we're going to get a different kind of higher education system together. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. So we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Hi, I'm a second year PhD student at Dartmouth and a member of organizing committee. And I wanted to ask a question to Alan. And first of all, thank you for your great talk. It really resonated with me, what you said about challenging the logic of capitalism and not merely creating a new bureaucratic structure that will manage the workforce. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think fostering critical thinking should happen? And how do you balance that with the urgency of everyday action and wanting to have a contract as fast as we can, to have childcare, to have healthcare, to have all of the things that we need in the here and now, but also having this long-term vision that won't make of our unions that we create right now this sort of managing force that will turn against us at some point.
Yeah, thanks again for a great panel. So I want to think about this question about students, and I want to push you a little bit, Barry, on this, because if we look at the example from Chile, where students went on strike in 2006 at the kind of middle school, high school level, and then again in 2011 at the university level, their 9-month strike led to essentially free tuition at the public institutions and then highly subsidized tuition at some of the private institutions, and have, they've fundamentally changed the university structures, right? And I think if you look at CUNY, you can say the same thing about the open admissions struggles. When students strike, not just protest, but strike, it can change kind of the power relations in the university. And especially being in New York with our current situation, I think a lot about, for probably most of the time I've been in the labor movement, my line was, it is not our job to organize students. Students need to organize students. It's not my job to organize students. And I think I've been converted now, because I think we really have to take seriously that. I think that the fact that CUNY students are so demobilized right now does impact our ability to fight and win. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
Hi, thank you all so much. I wanted to invite Jamie to describe more the rank and file bulletin that you mentioned. This is something we've tried to do in the context of strikes and ongoing struggles to intervene in very messy debates and this sort of thing. But it sounds like, and I've seen some of them as an ongoing project of presenting rank and file contributions on labor struggle, on work conditions, et cetera. And I guess I'm interested in how you do that, the sort of nitty gritty of how that is possible.
Anyone can start.
Does this come up? So happy to answer an organizing question with an organizing answer. First, I want to address briefly the question of urgency. I bet everybody in this room feels urgent all the time about every crisis that is facing you. So I'd love to invite you to reconsider that and whether or not that serves you well. The problems were there, 5 years ago, they were there yesterday, they're there today, they're going to be there tomorrow. So the problems are not going away. And urgency will sometimes drive us to do things when we are inadequately prepared. And so I would say better to take more time to organize and prepare yourself and not be driven by a sense of urgency. The question of sort of the fostering of critical thinking. So here's what I've developed in recent years. Think about how it feels to be in the boss's space or if you're locked in a bad union, how it feels to be in the space of a bad union. And however that feels, do the opposite. So if, for example, your staff meetings are such, or your union meetings are such, where someone comes in from the front of the room and lectures at you and is very defensive if you ask questions, or doesn't want to promote any debate or hear your ideas or share the dialogue, don't do that. Do the opposite of that. Figure out how to make meetings, and I know that your crew in Dartmouth, because I know we've talked over a period of time, you started with a kind of a strategy, which I think is the sort of mobilized strategy, go out, collect cards, you code everybody, you assess everybody, who are the 1, 2s, and 3s, and get them to sign cards, and you realized that was looking like sort of a dead end, and you turned yourselves around and took a different approach. I think that shows this kind of brilliance of critical thinking, right? That approach, the metricization of organizing, that belongs to our bosses. That sometimes belongs to our union bosses. Let's not do that, right? Let's make relationships with people, sincerely, authentically engaging people in discussion, not waiting for them to give us the answer that we went there to get, but actually having dialogue. People will feel that respect. They will be drawn to you because it's a space that feels like a respectful space. They're going to want to come back. They're going to want to bring their ideas, even if their ideas are partially formed. They won't be ridiculed. They won't be demeaned. They won't be made to feel like, why are you making suggestions? You don't know anything. Because, I know everything, right? So that's how I think you foster that.
Yes, we can go in order, I guess. So is this, okay, this is working. Yeah, thanks for the question, Carolina. Yeah, I think that I'm in my remarks, I was fairly down on student activism, and I think it's important to distinguish between sort of I wasn't trying to make a general critique of the limits of student activism, but rather trying to explain what I saw as why we're seeing a turn towards unionism in campuses in the U.S. today. I think that is informed by sort of my analysis of what has happened in the U.S. student movement, and sort of which has not really adopted a strike tactic in a sustained way. But by all means, we can look at I think the Chilean example is a great one. In my home province of Quebec, the student movement in 2012 brought down the government. So I'm not trying to say that student activism at all times and all places is a dead end. In the U.S. context, the record's pretty limited. I think that there are some, and to the extent that there are successes on campus, right? So I think that the open admissions policy is a good one. Another one is just the creation of Chicano studies, Black studies, is a direct result of mass student mobilization. But a lot of the trajectory of the New Left in the 1970s was a direct outgrowth of the New Left bumping up against the hard limits of student activism. And then that led in multiple different paths, right? It led towards, the sort of insurgent dead end of the Weather Underground. It also led some to form, to make a turn to industry and form things like labor notes, and it led in a bunch of other directions. So I think, again, it's that we need to sort of understand the role of student activism in different sort of national and historical contexts.
Yeah, I think the questions were great. I have something briefly to say on students, so my experience of being a student was so different to that of my students today. And I think a lot of my students today spend most of their time working and only a small amount of time on the campus. We had a subsidized student bar when I was a student. We spent a lot of time on campus. There were free meeting rooms. It was a very different experience. And I think one of the things we should take seriously as academics in the university is if students aren't mobilizing around collective issues in the university, Many of them are working in the same workplaces outside the university. And thinking about how, I always think of this as like trade union aunties and uncles that some of us have because we've been in the union movement or small left-wing parties in our youth or whatever it is. Most of our students don't have that. They don't have people who can give them that advice. And there's still the potential for student movements to happen, but at least that way people are getting organizing experience whilst they're at university. In terms of rank and file bulletins, the university worker started when 4 of us were frustrated with being part of a national union that had very bad communication. One of the challenges we have, and our wall-to-wall organizing that we sort of have in Britain, it's not a solution to everything, right? It comes with many contradictions, many problems. And one of the biggest ones for us was sharing stories about what was working from one campus to another. So we started by inviting people at other campuses to write about how the picket lines were going, write a paragraph. We put them all together into a document, we printed them out, we handed them out. Give you a very short anecdote. The first one we ever did, we took to a picket line and somebody came up to us and said, "What is this? Why are you handing this out?" We said, "Oh, well, because the union won't tell us what's happening on other campuses." We said, "Oh, who are you?" And they said, "Well, I'm the head of communications for the union." And so we doubled down and said, "Oh, so you know how bad the communication is." And they kind of took one and walked off. But more seriously, it's about trying to say that we don't have to wait for other people to do it. And we've been through a number of phases with it, but what we've tried to do with the bulletin is say that the experience of rank and file members matters, the contributions that they have to make matter, and that sharing them is a political practice. More recently, we've started hosting debates on strategy in the bulletin. James's piece with Zara at Queen Mary is an example of this, which I think has been quite useful to platform views and argue them out. But also trying to set up, we have a WhatsApp group with representatives from different universities to share things and share stories and so on. But it's just experimenting with doing things without asking somebody else to do it. And we've made a number of missteps and we've done things wrong and had interventions that didn't work at various points, but at least we were trying to do something. And it's about trying to raise that confidence of rank and file members that they can participate. And we have a long account of the university worker in a recent issue of Notes from Below if you're interested in reading a bit more about it.
Okay, everyone, we're at time for this session. So we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. There's wine and cheese on the second floor. Thank you all so much for such a great discussion. We'll see you there.